Okay, hi folks, hope you can hear me. We're going to talk a little bit about rapid remote work adoption with Azure, specifically Azure AD, and some of the extended capabilities that Azure AD offers to help companies, especially in times like these, to kind of rapidly switch their mode of operation and maybe offer an easier implementation path to publishing some of their apps remotely. So I'm sure you folks have seen something like this, where in all these emails that are coming out about the COVID-19 and self-isolation. I know myself, I've looked at several of these types of slides, but I thought it was important enough to kind of bring up that I wanted to include it in my presentation. So, really when we're looking at rapidly enabling remote access, one of the top issues that we need to be aware of is the lack of security awareness to our users. And that, coupled with poor identity management, whether we permit weak passwords or users are using compromised identities, say, to log into some things with the same username password combination across multiple apps. If any of those things have been compromised on one of the big kind of data dumps that we've heard about in the last few years, then you could seriously be putting yourself in jeopardy if, say, a user's using a home laptop or a home PC. Then, of course, we've got the traditional unpatched systems, lack of proper backups, and the rising use of shadow IT. So what's a good method to implement and enable this remote work? Well, we see that there's 8 key security considerations that we really recommend that customers consider. So first is, you need to determine what kind of endpoint protection you're going to require for your remote users. And you may have a stance that they have to use only managed machines and managed devices, maybe a device that's registered in Azure Hybrid AD Join or through Intune. And then the second step is you need to review what software the remote employees are going to need to stay productive, right? And ensuring that that remote access doesn't include more risk. But then in this presentation, we're going to talk about once you've gone through those first 3 steps and you're realistic about your goals and you've talked to your security team and your IT organization to kind of define those things, what can you do to kind of turn some of these services on in a quick manner? Now, some of you may be going, well, I already have MFA turned on, or we already have self-service password reset. So I'm going to kind of blow through some of these kind of marketing slides on those, but I'm going to show you some new either features that they've turned on or new changes that may have occurred since you've last set those things up. So I'd encourage you to stick around to see what those are. So self-service password reset, this is something that you can enable pretty quickly and doesn't require a huge amount of communication to the users. But it really helps reduce some of your help desk cost, especially in a environment where people are logging in from different areas or they're using different machines, and maybe they have old cache credentials on a device. You don't want them to be going through account lockouts and having to have that one lone help desk person or your service desk field calls just to unlock a password or maybe do a password change. So password reset supports those, as well as a password write back to your local Active Directory through Active Directory Connect. And you can leverage this not only in cloud-only scenarios, but also in the hybrid scenarios with that write back. So some of the authentication methods that supports is through an office phone. So they would pull this property from your on-premises Active Directory and the telephone number that's logged in there, and the user can't change this. The users can also opt for an authentication phone where they are entering a mobile phone number, and users can either request a callback or approve a request for access based with the Microsoft Authenticator app. They can go through email, and again, this is another attribute that's mapped from your on-premises Active Directory, or the user can specify an alternate email during registration, and you can go with security questions. Now, a couple things in regards to security questions. Many of them have the city as an answer, and if you, in setting this up, you make the city questions available to your users and you have more than one, there's a chance that you'll have multiple users have the same answer to multiple questions. So one approach to this is to select one city-related question and then select remaining questions from the non-city relating ones. So let's talk a little bit about the MFA feature. We're seeing in our customer base that many people have questions about the various versions of MFA, so I wanted to briefly cover that. You can have MFA across your Microsoft Enterprise subscriptions or your Office Enterprise subscriptions, or with EMS, or use a free version, and each has its own pros and cons. These slides will be available at some point after this meeting, so you can refer to the resource links that I'm putting in some of these. But you really get the cool features, and by cool I mean the risk-based conditional access, with your Azure AD Premium subscriptions. You can see that kind of illustrated here. So the free that comes with either security defaults or just a free Azure AD subscription have a lot less rich conditional access support or user registration options. So make sure you understand the difference before you implement and validate that you have your licensing in line. Here's a second indication of, just from a second factor perspective, what the security defaults, which is what you would get for free, compared to one of the other premium subscriptions in Azure AD. So with security defaults, your users are pretty much limited to notification through a mobile app, but there are a couple other ways for second factor with the premium licensing. And with that free, it's important to note that MFA is enabled for all users, including admins, and it's really not Microsoft's recommended approach for large enterprises, because every time a user tries to access an Office 365 service, they'll be prompted for MFA. However, it is very easy and simple to turn on, and I'm going to show you that. And after you've turned it on, each of your users has 2 weeks to get registered before they lose access. And Azure MFA with conditional access, which again comes with the premium Azure AD subscription plans, is much richer. It supports many other signals like device-based rule sets or risk-based rule sets done in real time to go through a decision tree to verify the access attempt and decide whether we need to enforce the MFA policy or not. Now, it's really, really super important that if you have MFA stood up today or conditional access stood up today, and you're going to make any changes to your existing rules, that you make sure that you have that break glass account either for a global admin account or for some super secret, user accounts, that you exclude them from that MFA and conditional access policy. So I'm going to show you a little bit here on the MFA and what we can do in a scenario with like apps or SaaS apps or Office 365 apps that may be federated with Azure AD. So there's a couple scenarios here that might block our rapid adoption of remote access. For instance, conditional access rules could be in place already, or some other IDP system is doing additional authorization rules, or we may have some internal web applications that we don't have line of sight to without a VPN, or third, perhaps there's an internal or SaaS app that's federated with something like ADFS, and we have a couple blockers in place where maybe the app's either not published through WAP or there's some network-based authorization rules that are blocking this, and I'm going to talk through each of those scenarios. So apps that are federated through AD, we can enable combined registration for users, which basically takes the self-service password reset and the multi-factor authentication registration and combines them into a single registration policy. So to do that, because in the past, those were separate methods, authentication methods, one for MFA and one for self-service password reset. And people were confused that there were two similar methods used for that. And it was very difficult to message the instructions out to the users to support those two different scenarios. So Microsoft has combined those into a single registration URL. So if you go into your Azure AD and you come down here into, where am I? Into user settings, sorry about that. Down at the bottom, you'll see a new link for this preview feature, manage user feature preview settings. And if you select users can preview features for registering and managing security info and click save, then that combined registration feature becomes active. And this is what you would see. This oops look like you don't have the experience configured prior to doing that, and hopefully if the demo gods are with me, I know this URL is kind of hard to see, but if you send your users to aka.ms/mysecurityinfo, now they have the combined user experience, and they can come in to add a method, like say the Authenticator app, and they can follow the wizard and become registered for both Active Directory and MFA and the self-service password reset. It's important to note that after you've turned that on and you've gotten your users registered, you can't leverage the security defaults to rapidly turn on MFA if you're already using conditional access. So if you have CA in place, then when you go to turn on the security defaults, you're going to get a little pop-up message, and it's not going to work for you. So to turn on the security defaults to rapidly get the MFA configured, we go down here back into our Active Directory. We go to the Manage Blade, come down here to Properties, And down at the end, there's a link for managed security defaults. And just by clicking yes and hitting save, if you don't have a premium license, you can enforce that MFA for all users with all access attempts very easily. And then, as I said, the users are going to have 2 weeks to complete the registration process here at the My Security Info before any kind of access is going to be interrupted for them. Now, it's important to note that this isn't a general blanket 2-week timer. Each user gets 2 weeks after their first interactive logon after you've enabled the security defaults or the MFA policy. So if I go back to my slideshow, excuse me. We also have to look after we've turned on MFA, perhaps you're federated and you're using an identity management system, and you might have some network blocks in your policies. So this would be an example in my issuance authorization rules where if I'm coming in from the corporate network, I want to block access. And we want to remove that rule so that we can force Active Directory Federation services to work with MFA now that we've enabled that up in the cloud. So you really want to get rid of that blocker and have this permit everyone to remove that network condition from your identity management system. And we want to alter our Office 365 relying party to permit all access. And this will basically allow us to say, let's allow MFA to do the heavy lifting on the authorization of the user once it gets out there. And again, in ADFS 2016, there's some additional options. For example, a lot of times we'll see this permit everyone for intranet access and grant them access and deny everything else. You want to eliminate that, and you want to allow the permit everyone and grant access so that, again, we're not enforcing any conditional access rules, network-based, email property, or whatnot from the federation system, and we're pushing that up now instead back into Azure AD. So what do you do if you have conditional access in place and you want to block everything, right? Like, one of the things we've learned talking to customers the last month is, although they want to enable work quickly, they only want to open things up a little bit. And one of those may be, I want to give them access to Office 365 apps only, but nothing else. Now, it's worth noting that this isn't really a best practice from a Microsoft perspective. The best practice is to not do like a block policy, and instead do recommended discrete conditional access policies to the apps that really require it. But customers are asking about it, so we wanted to provide a little bit of guidance and best practice around that. So if you go into security and open up your conditional access, you might have something like this: block outside corporate network, right? So in here, I'm blocking all users. Note, I've excluded a group, right? BG accounts here. which are my big guns accounts that I want to exclude from these policies, kind of like my break glass. And from an application perspective, in this particular rule, I'm blocking access to Exchange Online from any location unless they're in my trusted locations, right? And I'm going to block access. In this policy, I've configured an example where we want to loosen that up and we want to block all apps except for Office 365. So in here where I have the cloud apps, and I say I want to exclude all cloud apps, and what you want to do is come into the exclude section, and very recently, I think this is about, I don't know, 6 months old or so, Microsoft has added an umbrella app here for us to exclude Office 365. I'm sorry, I wanted to have this resolution big enough so you could see, but it's really crimping my ability here. And it's important that if you start changing these access control policies, that you make sure that another new feature here, you want to probably start with enabling report only. And what this is going to do is allow you to set up a log analytics workspace to your Office 365. And once you have that set up, and I'm sorry, this is a demo tenant, so I don't have a whole bunch of information here, but it gives you this nice little workbooks capabilities where after you have configured your log analytics and configured some policies, you can go into this conditional access insights blade. And this will give you good information of not only the registration and how fast your people are signing in and registering to your policies, but also track and log kind of what if scenarios for your report only policies, so you can see if you have some problems with failures or things getting blocked accidentally. So you can go through some of these scenarios, maybe a couple weeks with your report only, check out the metrics in the workbooks and make sure that it's working as you expect, right? So as I said, you know, you can click into any of these and you can get better a better idea of how well your policies are going. And also in your user insights, if you go to the authentication methods, you can see registration details and see who's not registered, or see how many people that you've marked and how well your communication has been going out to the users and what your adoption rates are. And then I wanted to touch briefly, and I'm sorry, this is like a hour presentation squeezed into a 30-minute slot, so I can't go too deep with this, but I wanted to show you what we can do with, now that we have spoken with our security teams and determined what kind of access we need, and we've selected the proper multi-factor auth and enabled SSPR, and we've gone through and removed any network blockers from our identity management system, our federated systems, and change maybe some of the conditional access rules to not be as restrictive and include MFA as a control. Now we want to go through and maybe publish some applications with Azure AD Application Proxy. Now we're moving into internal web apps and accessing these without a VPN. Azure AD Application Proxy has been around for quite a while, and Microsoft considers it kind of like a remote access as a service. Users don't need a VPN client, but they do have to pass all conditional access policies before access is granted. Now, the way this works is there are agents that you install in some of your Windows servers on premises, and you can install 2 or you can install 20. They're free agents. I'm going to show you how to get access to those. And those agents will load balance the traffic up to the Azure AD Application Proxy. What's critical to know is that the agents don't need any inbound firewall rule changes. The only ports that are in use are outbound 443, and they'll kind of perform like a reverse proxy apps that you specify to your users. So the user is basically sent through Azure AD. You get some enforcement on multi-factor auth and conditional access if you have those configured, and then the connector will serve up that connection through outbound 443. So there's 6 different types supported of apps for this methodology. So we can use browser-based web apps with Windows auth or forms-based auth, browser-based apps using things like a SAML or header-based auth. There's even support for rich client web apps that leverage ADAL or other apps through like remote desktop. So here's kind of a picture of the architecture and how Azure AD Application Proxy works. So after the users access the application through their endpoint, they're redirected to Azure AD sign-in. And if you've configured conditional access, specific conditions are checked at that time to make sure they comply with whatever policies you set up, right? So after a successful sign-in, Azure AD sends a token to the user's device. The client sends a token to the app proxy service, which retrieves a UPN and SPN from the token. Then the application proxy forwards that request, which is picked up by the proxy connectors. Someone has a hot mic. Then those connectors perform an additional auth required on behalf of the user and request the internal endpoint of the app server to send the request back to the on-premises application. Then the response from the app server is sent through the connector to the proxy service. And finally, the response is sent from the application proxy service to the user. So we go through the portal. You can get there. I've highlighted here under managed, and this is again an Active Directory. If you hit application proxy, you can go to the download a connector page here and accept the terms and download that file. Pretty simple install. Each app proxy agent must have line of sight to the apps that you want to publish, however. So you have to make sure that wherever you decide to place these agents, and again, they can be on any type of member server in your on-premises environment, they need to have line of sight, meaning no firewall blocking access to the app servers that you want to publish. And if your app is doing any kind of integrated Windows auth like Kerberos, it needs line of sight to an AD controller too. And the reason is, if you're doing something like, say, constrained delegation, that agent needs to be able to request that Kerberos ticket on behalf of the user. So they need access to the domain controller in order to do that. So, it's pretty easy. You get the MSI, you take the MSI over to the server, you agree to the license term, you hit install, and a couple minutes later, I've highlighted the two services that you'll see running on the install or running on the server, and that's pretty much the easy part. My computer is frozen. My computer is frozen, folks, and I don't know if I want to go through and do a reboot. So we'll hang out on this slide for a little bit, and I'll do my best to explain the rest. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and somebody will follow up with you. But after you've installed the agent, you then have to go back into the portal and go into your enterprise apps and register the application. And when you go to register the application, you'll see a couple options, and one of the options is register an on-premises app. So if you've set everything up right, you have AD Connect running, you have the agent on, you have the line of sight clear. When you install the app, you should be able to go through and create that app registration, and then use that app registration very much like we did with the Windows Office 365 apps example in your conditional access rules to then enforce any of your conditional access policies, including the MFA. So that's one, fairly quick and painless way to get these apps published out to your users quickly without having to suddenly scale up your VPN concentrator licenses or buy more VPN tokens, yet still be assured of secure access to those apps. And you can even do that with ADFS federated apps. It's a little bit more involved. In the slide deck, I'll have a link to an AKAMS shortcut that gives you a little bit additional information. The quick version is if you install the AD Connect Health on your on-premises ADFS servers, that'll communicate up with Azure AD, and it'll evaluate your existing published apps to see if they're compatible with Azure AD App Proxy, and if they are, they'll be populated up in the list in the cloud for you to select as well. And there are several different versions of apps. Obviously, or am I doing Pass-through or Azure Active Directory, integrated auth or header-based auth, and your app proxy allows you to configure all those options and can really make a big impactful difference on getting these things published securely yet quickly. So sorry I encountered a freeze. I don't know, Anthony, if you can unpresent for me, or I can just power off my machine. Thank you guys for your time. And again, if there are any questions, I can't see them currently, so throw them up in the chat window, and somebody from Bennett Adelson will follow up with you next week to give you more information. Thank you, guys.
All right. Hey,